All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Chamber U for March the 22nd, how to engage and motivate today's five-generation workforce. Today we have Whitney Watson. Whitney is an integrated communications professional with more than 30 years of experience in the trenches, helping businesses and organizations of all sizes better communicate with their stakeholders. And so I know Lori Whitney had heard you before at a presentation, and she wanted to bring you in to maybe allow you to share some of your knowledge and expertise with our chamber members. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you maybe further introduce yourself, and then we'll bring your presentation into the broadcast. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate it. I love being with different chambers of commerce. Let me apologize first for my voice. I played in a golf tournament yesterday out in the Flint Hills. So we had constant 20-mile-an-hour winds with gusts up to 35.
Oh, my goodness.
I think every allergen from the western part of the U.S. blew into my sinuses. So,
and maybe some other things, too. Who knows?
That's right. Yeah. So, and that's our excuse for us not having a good score yesterday in that tournament. But so I apologize if I sniffle or clear my throat or cough a little bit more than normal here today. But yeah, I'm coming to you live from my guest room in lovely Topeka, Kansas. I spent the last 5 years working in Kansas City and Independence, Missouri, and I was very active with the Chamber of Commerce there on the board of directors. Actually, I was the Distinguished Board Member of the Year back in 2018, so I'm proud of that. But I've had an occasion to speak to chambers all over the Kansas City area and the Missouri State Chamber, and really happy to be with you down in St. Louis area. 30 seconds or 60 seconds about me. I'm a Kansas boy, Kansas City born and bred. But both of my degrees are from Missouri schools. I have an undergraduate degree in communication from Southwest Baptist University down in Bolivar, Missouri. And my master's degree is in communications management from Webster down there in beautiful Webster Groves, Missouri. I've spent in one form or another my entire career in communications. And what really gets me excited is helping organizations of all sizes learn how to better reach and engage and motivate their workforce. And so that is really what makes me tick. And I'm really proud and happy to be able to share this information with you today. So we're going to get started. I'm going to come through this presentation at a pretty good pace. And please enter in your questions. I think there's a function, Scott, where they can type in questions and we'll address those questions at the end.
There is, yeah. They will have they can share it anytime they want, and then we'll bring it up on the screen and we'll ask you the question because you may not be able to see it. So we'll make sure that we ask the question to you, and that way you know what they're asking. So, but yeah, people can go ahead and ask questions whenever they want. Or if they just want to comment, just enter it into the chat or comment section of whatever social media platform they're on, and we'll try to go from there. So yeah.
Well, great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started now. Right. I love this picture. It's a picture of a welcome sign in an airport. And when I first saw this, it really clicked, and I said, this is what it's all about. You see the same message, but in different languages. Well, why is that? Well, of course, because as visitors fly into the airport from other countries, they may not speak our language. They may not speak English. So this airport and the community that put this up just wanted those visitors to know that they appreciated them and that they welcomed them into their community. Well, today's multi-generational workforce is very similar. There are 5 generations in the workforce today, and each one of those generations speaks their own language. And so we have to, if we want to make them feel welcome, and we want to make sure that they know that we appreciate them and welcome them into our organizations and want them to be a valuable part of our organization, we have to learn how to speak their languages. And this is really the first time in history this has happened, that there are 5 generations in the workforce. So today what we're going to do is we're going to define those different generations for you. We're going to examine some of the challenges of communicating with today's generationally diverse workforce, going to explore each generation's preferred methods for communication, and then we're going to learn together what we can do to more effectively reach today's growing multi-generational workforce. Here's a quote that I love. It's from a guy named Roger Dupree. Now, if you're a professional communicator, you no doubt know that name. If your career is in another field, you may not. 2 great books that he wrote. One is called Communicating for Change, and the other, which is one I highly recommend everyone take a look at. It's called Communicating with Today's Skeptical Workforce, the Credible Company. And he was a big communication leader a few years back for big companies like General Electric. He says communications aimed at everyone often reach no one. And it's very true. So we have to figure out how these generations think and communicate so that we're able to more effectively reach each particular targeted member of this workforce. Another quote from a communicator and a sociologist, her name is Meredith Broomfield. She says, if we learn to speak the language of the people we want to reach, it will be easier for them to like us and trust us. She also notes that every generation has their own language. So once again, it goes back to that illustration with the sign. If we want to reach each generation that's represented in our workforce, we have to learn how to speak their language. Because each generation's different, it's often easy for us to get in the mindset that, hey, you're different from how I am, and so you're wrong. Really, the most productive way and the way that a true leader will look at that difference is, hey, you're not wrong, you're just different. So as we're going through each one of these generations, especially the generations that is different from the generation that you're a part of, think about times when maybe those differences really were pronounced and that you had difficulty connecting with someone from a different generation. And I hope that what you'll do is realize, wow, that's why they thought the way they did, or that's why they acted the way they did, or that's why they communicated the way they did. And I thought they were big jerks, or I thought that they were wrong just because they're different. But the reality is they weren't wrong. They were just different from us. And I love this illustration. In order to reach members of each generation, we have to first understand the differences that we have from them. We have to learn what motivates them. We have to learn what shapes their thinking. And when you look at those sunglasses, they represent a collective lens that each generation looks for. I mean, think about it. Each generation looks at the world, they have a different worldview. They look at the world through lenses that are based on their experiences, their needs, their motivations. And in order for us to better understand them and to be able to lead them and be able to communicate with them, we have to look at the world through the same lenses that we're looking through. So as we go forward and break down these 5 generations, I want you to think about this. Think about how the experiences that they have had in their lives, how those experiences have shaped their lives, shaped their thinking, shaped their learning styles. And when we do that, we're a lot better able to communicate with them and connect with them and lead them. And that's really the first step toward being an effective leader, is looking at the world through the same lenses that they're looking at the world at. So again, as we said it before, today's workforce is comprised of individuals from 5 generations. Those generations are the silent generation, also known as the pre-boomers. Of course, the baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, also known as Gen Y, and then the newest generation to enter the workforce, the post-millennials, they're called Gen Z, also known as the I-Gen. And we're going to break down each one of those generations for you here and take a look at how the generations work. Now, one quick caveat for you. I'm going to spend less time on the silent generation, the baby boomers, and even to a certain extent the Gen Xers, just because I want to spend more time dealing with the newest generations in the workforce today, because that's going to be a challenge, especially for those of us who aren't millennials or who aren't Gen Zers, in order to be able to connect with them. And so be warned, I'm not trying to, this isn't an affront to boomers or pre-boomers or Gen Xers, but I want to make sure we spend a lot of time toward the end talking about the millennials and the Gen Z, because they do play an important part in the workforce today, as you see. So how this is structured is we're just going to go through, and I'm going to break down each generation, tell you a little bit about them. For example, the silent generation, believe it or not, we still have members of that generation in our workforce. Those folks were born between 1928 and 1945. That makes them currently 76 to 93 years old. They still comprise 2% of the workforce. So we still have a lot of folks in organizations who are in that age bracket. The silent generation is a very strong generation. They're very self-sufficient. They do prefer oftentimes to work behind the scenes. They are really good team players. They generally don't ruffle a lot of feathers. They don't initiate conflict. Now, here's Whitney's caveat number 2. As we describe these generations and we go through different skills that they have, different idiosyncrasies that they have, you're going to probably remember or recognize people in your organizations or through your career that fit into these categories. There are also members of each generation in the workforce today that don't have those same traits. For example, we'll learn in a minute that silent gen members aren't a whole lot of technology. They don't use a lot of technology. However, we probably all know an 80-year-old person who is very tech literate, who uses social media a lot, who uses a smartphone a lot. That's not the norm, obviously. So just know that there are exceptions to each rule, and we'll talk about it at the end, but that's why it's so important that you know the members of your team, know how they communicate individually rather than just as a group. So here are some of the events that define this generation. Remember we talked about the collective lenses? Well, the silent generation, what colors their lenses that they look at the world through are events such as the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War. I mean, if you have parents who were old parents like mine were, who grew up in the Depression, maybe you remember keeping the little ketchup packets when you went out to a restaurant, to a McDonald's, or keeping the styrofoam cups when you went through an Arby's and rinsing it out and put it in the cabinet. Those are just things that they were raised doing, and so they oftentimes did those things through their entire lives. So boomers, pre-boomers are very conservative folks. They're very loyal to their employers. They respect structure and authority. They generally keep their thoughts to themselves. They may only speak when spoken to, which is not a bad thing. They have very little to say, but if you do engage them, they will often give you great advice, great words of wisdom based on their experience. So here's how you effectively communicate with groups of this generation. They prefer to receive their materials in writing. They began their careers and spent most of their careers in an age where memo was king. So make sure that the communication is very formal, it's very respectful, it's very professional. And I know in this day and age, when we rely on email and when we rely on texts, this generation really would prefer, for the most part, to receive those materials in writing. So consider, if you have someone from that generation in your workforce, doing that. They like to receive feedback in the form of memos and letters and personal notes if you need to share feedback at all. But this generation is a big believer in the saying, no news is good news. They don't require a lot of hand-holding. They don't require a lot of feedback. But if you want to give them an attaboy or an attagirl, a handwritten note would mean the world to them. Tell them how much you respect their experience, because this generation takes great satisfaction in doing a job well done. They want to make sure that they are still contributing and that they are not just a burden to an organization. And I can tell you from personal experience, I know someone who's in his early to mid 80s who is very active in his company still, and he contributes a lot. He loves knowing that he can still contribute to his organization. So if you have someone from this generation who's still in your workplace, The next generation, of course, are the baby boomers. These folks were born between 1946 and 1964, so that puts them 57 to 75 years of age. They comprise 25% of the workforce today. However, I threw an interesting tidbit in there. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 28 million baby boomers have retired, and a greater number are in the process of retiring. This was a generation for the first time to grow up with television, with audio cassettes, with fast food, with credit cards. Obviously, they've seen and experienced a lot of changes during their careers. And what this has done is it's made them quite flexible in their thinking. So some of the defining events for this generation, obviously the birth of television, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, Woodstock, Watergate. So again, these are the events that have colored how they look at the world and how they look at the business world in particular. Baby boomers are very ambitious. They're very loyal to their careers. They're very loyal to their employers. Part of that has to do with the fact that they have gone through multiple recessions. They've gone through the highs and lows more than any other generation probably. And so they are very loyal. When they get a good position, a good job, they stick with it. They stick to it. These are the folks in your organization probably who are the 30 and 35 and 40-year veterans of your company, folks to have around. Very flexible in their thinking. They aren't afraid to question authority. And again, think back. What are some of the events that shaped their worldview? The Vietnam War, war protests, protesting President Nixon, things like that during that era. So because of that, they aren't afraid to question authority. Boomers are the largest segment of the workforce today for the time being, but that's going to change any day now. So here's how you communicate with baby boomers. They really prefer communication to be interpersonal or over the telephone. And when I say over the telephone, I don't mean send them a message or send them a text. They are just as happy picking up the phone and hearing your friendly voice and communicating that way. They do use social media quite a bit. They use Facebook, which is why a lot of the millennials and Gen Zs no longer use Facebook, that they've jumped over to Instagram because they don't want to communicate with their grandma every day. They use LinkedIn a lot. They use smartphones and tablets. They do rarely use these devices for texting, and they also much prefer to use these devices for business or for pleasure, but not for business. They want to have their work-life balance separated in that way. Offer them new experiences. Again, this is a generation that maybe after graduating from high school, backpacked around Europe for 8 months before they went to college, or joined the Peace Corps for 2 years before they went to school or after school. So they are not afraid of experiencing new things. They like to experience new things. So give them those opportunities. It is interesting to note that boomers spend the most on technology from any other group. Maybe it's because they have the most disposable income. Their kids are all grown and out of the house. They've been saving. They're good savers. So perhaps that's the reason why. But regardless of the reason, just know the boomers do have the technology. They know how to use the technology. They just may not necessarily like to use that technology for business as opposed to pleasure. So now we're going to Gen Xers, of which I am one, proudly. We were born between 1965 and 1980, so we're currently 41 to 56 years old. Gen Xers currently account for 33% of the workforce. We grew up in an era of the big blockbuster movies, Top Gun, for example, music videos, Nintendo, Pac-Man, the Walkman, and we were the first generation with cable TV. Members of this generation are more moved by images and graphics rather than by written words. So you will oftentimes notice this in print advertising, that it's targeting Gen Xers. You will see great images of vacation destinations or images of Gen Xers with their grandkids, with not a lot of ad copy, more image heavy than copy heavy. Currently, 51% of all global leadership roles are held by Gen Xers. And again, as this generation gets older, you will see more people from this generation retiring as well. In fact, during the pandemic times, we have seen a tremendous move of early Gen Xers, those who were in their mid to late 50s, who have already decided to retire. They've made plans and preparations. They weren't necessarily planning on retiring before the age of 60 or 62 or 65, but just because of changes that have occurred because of the pandemic, they pulled the trigger and now they're retired. And we're going to see that trend continuing over the years. So here are some of the defining events that defined my generation, shaped our way of thinking. Do y'all remember the milk cartons with the missing kids pictures on it? Did anybody else have a mom who, if you ask them if you could go play at a park down the street, said, well, you're going to end up like little Tommy Jones from Birmingham, Alabama, and hold up the milk carton? We were the first generation to have computers in the classroom. We grew up with MTV and music videos. We all obviously remember the Challenger disaster and the fall of communism. Those were all big events that shaped who we became, especially early in our careers, and who we've become throughout our careers. Our generation is very independent and very self-sufficient. You know, that's why we're called the latchkey kids, also known as the sandwich generation. Again, I came from kind of a non-traditional family in the sense that my dad worked and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. I say that's non-traditional because for the previous generations, that was considered traditional. For my generation, it was kind of unique. Most of my friends had parents who both of them worked. And so they were the latchkey kids. They came home from school by themselves. They either made themselves a peanut butter sandwich or grabbed a snack. Oftentimes they had instructions written down on the kitchen counter telling them to, you know, thaw out the chicken or what time to start the dinner or what chores they needed to have done before their parents got home. So again, that created that independence, that created that self-sufficiency that you still see in Gen Xers today. Very results oriented. And one thing that's absolutely true for you, for me, and I'm sure it is for you if you're in my generation, we hate bureaucracy. We like to have clear, concise tasks. We don't like the middleman. Gen Xers are the folks who have the biggest struggles dealing with a lot of bureaucratic red tape in our organizations, especially working for larger corporations, which I have for the past 12 years. It is really challenging at times to live and to be able to function through those types of bureaucratic red tapes that we have. Members of our generation are really more likely to express our opinion about something without being asked, especially compared to the boomers and the silent generation. We were a generation that we were taught to stick up for ourselves and to not be afraid to share our opinions. And so we do oftentimes. And so you are more likely to get unsolicited feedback, sometimes unwelcome feedback, from Gen Xers than probably any other generation. So here's how you reach Gen Xers. Go straight to the point rather than beating around the bush. If you're going to send an email or a voicemail, that's very effective, but make sure that they're very specific and very clear. Specificity and clarity are very important to folks in this generation. We use today's technology, but remember, Gen Xers is another example of a group that likes to use a tech tool to get things done. It's a tool for efficiency and it promotes a better work-life balance. So again, I love using email. I love texting. I love sharing messages as long as it allows me to get my task done on target, on time, so that I can move on and go play golf in the 35-mile-an-hour wind. Gen Xers do appreciate regular feedback, but again, emails and conversations should be short and to the point. Again, we have a lot going on in our lives as Gen Xers, so we want to make sure that we are prioritizing the important things in life, our families and the charities we work for and our out of work in events. So make sure that any type of communication that you have with folks in this generation, it is to the point. And so it allows them to get their work done so they can move on to what's important to them. So I'm going to spend a little more time talking about millennials and the Gen Z folks before we take your questions. And again, because these generations play such an important role in the workforce today. So starting with millennials, the technical term is Gen Y. And I think that's because millennials very often ask why. Actually, I don't know if that's what it is, but that's just a personal observation based on my stepkids. Born between 1981 and 1996, members of the millennial generation are currently 25 to 40. They make up 35% of the workforce. Now, this generation is often referred to as the participation trophy generation. I didn't coin that term, so don't send me hate mail. I'll share with you, I gave this presentation to the Blue Springs, Missouri Chamber of Commerce, and a young millennial reporter for the local newspaper was in attendance. She actually flamed me without mentioning me by name in an opinion piece that she wrote in the newspaper. And she shared about how when she hears that phrase, participation trophy generation, it really hurts her and upsets her because she played softball all the time when she was growing up and she wasn't any good and her team wasn't any good. But the fact that they got that trophy at the end of the season made her feel good because she knew she tried. Well, there you go. Case in point. That's why they're called the participation trophy generation. These folks were raised with computers and smartphones. This generation is already the largest segment of the workforce, but if you can believe it, in the next 7 years, they will represent 75% of the global workforce. So if you don't know how to connect with a millennial by now, it's time to learn, because 3/4 of the people you're working with in the next 7 to 10 years are going to be in this generation. Obviously, some of the defining moments for folks in this generation, 9/11, of course, the Y2K crisis. Do you all remember Y2K, how the whole world was going to come to an end? Our computers wouldn't work and the entire infrastructure was going to shut down because of the Y2K bug that never happened. Columbine, of course, terrible school shootings that happened as this generation was growing up. And of course, the war on terror. I mean, you think about it, when millennials were growing up, pretty much every night that the news was on as they were eating dinner or as their folks were watching news, you had reports of what was going on in the war on terror following 9/11 or some other terrible event. And so those are just events that have, again, colored their collective lenses on how they look at the world today. And it explains to a certain degree why they are, how they are, and why they function the way they do. Millennials have had very protective parents. Again, this was really the first generation where the parents didn't spank their kids for the most part. And again, some millennials were spanked, but for the most part, this generation, they weren't. And if you think back and think about this for a minute, so that's the boomers' fault and the early Gen Xers' fault who raised millennials for not spanking them. So if we want to blame somebody for that, we can blame ourselves. But it's very important to note, they're very concerned with personal safety. Again, think about the events that they witnessed as they were growing up: school shootings, buildings being hit by airplanes, American soldiers who were 10 or 15 years older than they were going off to war. Those are all reasons why they have been very concerned about personal safety. And we found through the pandemic that millennials and the Gen Z are the ones who have been mostly impacted from an emotional standpoint to the pandemic, even though they have been very minimally affected from a physical standpoint to the COVID crisis. They're very technology dependent. Again, notice I didn't say they're technology literate. They are technology dependent. These folks in this generation have a difficult time functioning or being productive without using today's technology. Very entrepreneurial folks, very goals oriented. They feel very comfortable multitasking. And I think that comes in large part from the fact that these are folks who, had their cell phones or computers on while they're trying to do their homework, and they're doing 2 or 3 different things at once. This generation demands a work-life balance. They don't want a work-life balance. They don't appreciate a work-life balance. They demand a work-life balance. And many folks have seen that when they've hired a millennial who's as sharp as a tack, who does a great job. But when the clock strikes 5 o'clock or whatever time your company leaves, they're ready to move on and get on with their life. They want fun in the work environment. That's why for a long time you saw, especially in the tech sector, pool tables and video games and beer kegs and dartboards in the break areas of their companies, because that's what the millennials really wanted. They wanted to be able to have fun while they're working. Millennials are very future focused. They're very impatient. They always wonder what's next. And this is especially true when it comes to career advancement. Now, those of us who are Gen Xers or above, we don't necessarily expect to be promoted to vice president the first 18 months we join a company. This generation has a difficult time understanding why they can't be promoted to vice president after 18 months in an organization. And again, it comes back to that participation trophy. It comes back to the fact that this generation was nurtured to believe just showing up and doing a good job is enough, that you get the blue ribbon or you get an A on your paper. And earlier generations weren't raised that way for the most part. So again, it's not a fault. It's not a problem. We just have to understand that's how these folks operate so that we are better able to lead them. They also want their work to be meaningful. So this is a generation that corporate social responsibility really means something to them. They're the folks who will donate to the United Way campaigns. These are folks who will go out and work in neighborhood cleanup or community cleanup events. These are folks who will donate blood during blood drives. And so they also want to make sure that the work that they do every day just doesn't get them a paycheck, but it allows them to make a contribution to society. So here's how you communicate with millennials. Use today's technology. Use instant messaging. Use texting. Use email. Use video conferencing, blogging, and social networks. But face-to-face communication is also very effective with millennials. This generation not only wants to use technology, but they crave that interpersonal communication. They are very informal in their language, so be prepared for abbreviations, be prepared for slang and colloquialisms. But again, don't be taken aback. They're not formal like Silent Gen or baby boomers are. They really just prefer that informal communication. They want immediate feedback on their ideas, so give it to them. Now, here's one thing I will tell you as well. We do them a disservice if the only feedback we give them is positive feedback, if the idea isn't good. We need to be strong leaders, and if someone brings us an idea, and this goes for people of all generations, but particularly millennials, if they share an idea and it's not a good idea for whatever reason, break it down for them and explain to them why that idea is not a good one. If we don't do that and they share an idea and it's just ignored and they get crickets, they're probably not going to share an idea in the future. They are very hesitant to do that. And who knows, the next idea they bring might be the $1 million idea. So please don't be shy about giving them feedback one way or another. Find out a way to get them involved and get them feeling valued. Be transparent. This generation grew up in the age of political scandals. They grew up in the age of a lot of nonsense going on in the world. So they can spot a phony a mile away. So be transparent with them. Don't try and sugarcoat because it doesn't work. Talk to this group daily. They crave feedback. And they crave one-on-one assessments, especially if they're positive, if it's positive feedback. They really want that. I know it's very challenging to do in today's remote work environment, But as a communicator and a leader, you owe it to them and you owe it to yourselves to take the time to give them that personal feedback. It doesn't have to be long or involved, but they really do want that feedback. Now, final group, Gen Z, the post-millennials. Another caveat number 3, I guess, if you've noticed some of these age groups, the years that they were born, there's not a uniform consensus on how to break these out. Some people will say Gen Z was born after 2000 or 2001. Some will say they were born after 1995. Most of the research I've done, though, the dates that I've shared seems to be the consensus for when they're born. But if you read an article and it says that Gen Zs were born in 1995, don't send me hate mail or don't think I don't know what I'm talking about. It's just there's different divisions on those years. But so what we're going to do is work within the years born between 97 and 2012. So they're currently 9 years old and 24 years old. Gen Zs currently comprise 5% of the workforce. This generation, believe it or not, doesn't remember a time before the internet or before smartphones. That's why they're often referred to as the iGen, because they didn't know that life existed before the iPhone existed. This is a generation will walk into an older home and see a phone plug-in on the wall and ask what this is for, because they may not have ever used landline phones. Very young now, obviously, but this generation will soon emerge as being a very fast-paced and decisive generation. They want their information immediately, and they have the tools at their disposal to get it. So here are the events that have shaped how this generation is today and how they will be for the rest of their lives. The post-9/11 landscape, this generation never got on an airplane before having to walk through screeners or metal detectors, let alone they never flew on an airplane where there was smoking allowed on airplanes, or when they served you hot meals with actual silverware on an airplane. This generation is the first generation, again, when social media came about. They remember the recession of 2008, the BP Gulf spill, and of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to talk about that in detail in just a bit. But if you really think about it, this is the first generation that's really gone through, at such a young age, 2 recessions or 2 downturns in the economy. The Gen Z folks are very tech dependent. Now, here's what those numbers mean. 50% of all Gen Zs in a survey that was taken a couple of years ago reported that they spend at least 10 hours a day on their connected device outside of school or work necessity. So just for personal use, 10 hours a day on their devices. They spend 70% of them spend at least 2 hours of that 10 hours on TikTok or YouTube videos alone. So 70% of the entire generation spends at least 2 hours a day watching YouTube or TikTok videos. 80% of Gen Zs on this survey reported that they feel anxiety when they're actually separated from their connected devices, that they actually felt uncomfortable when they don't have that smartphone nearby. Gen Zs are all about instant gratification. Why is that? Because they've had the technology in their hands from the time they were 4 years old or 3 years old or 5 years old. And anytime you had to ask a question or anytime they wanted to see a video or anytime they wanted to get an answer to something, they had the answer right there. So they are very much into instant gratification. Gen Zs are very collaborative. However, 69% of this generation prefer their own workspace. Now think back, 10, 12 years ago, there was that big push toward cubicles in the workforce. Rather than folks having offices, we thought it was more important to the collaboration to bring everybody together. And so we had cubicles. Interestingly, though, 69% of these folks, they want their own space. And so I think as we return to work, as the remote work goes back to a traditional work setting, we're going to see over the next decade that trend going back to how it was before, say, a dozen years ago. Folks in this generation are very authentic. They're very open books. They keep very little private. And if you don't believe me, you probably know a Gen Z in your workforce that will be sure and tell you about every itch or burn or rash that they have, or what they did on their date, or what's going on with their families back home. They are very willing to be more open than many of us are comfortable with. But again, they are open books, and that's a very positive thing in a certain extent. They crave constant and immediate feedback, so don't be afraid to give it to them. This generation, probably more than any other generation, understands and appreciates the need for continual learning. 75% of folks in Gen Z want to wear multiple hats in an organization. Let them. If they have the skills and the talents and abilities to help you in other areas from the one that you hire them for, let them help you in those areas. As long as it doesn't interfere with their sole purpose or their main purpose, let them share their expertise and their skills and their knowledge with you. This generation is more adaptable to other generations' communication styles. It is oftentimes difficult for baby boomers to really get how Gen Zs are communicating or the tools that they're using, even though they try and they want to. Gen Zs, though, they're not opposed to communicating in writing if they need to. They're not opposed to communicating by phone if they need to. They can adapt as the situation requires. So allow them to do that. So here's how you effectively communicate with this group. They're not a formal generation at all. This is a generation that is not afraid to not address you as Mr. Watson or Mrs. Watson or Judge Watson, whatever the case is. They will, from the time they're 10 years old or 11 years old, call you Whitney. And again, part of that is how they were raised. Their Gen X parents, maybe they just wanted to be more cool. So they've told their kids' friends, oh, call me Bill, call me Joe. So refrain from that formality if at all possible. Communicate through text and instant messaging. That's the best way for them. However, be very generous with your face-to-face time. 72% of Gen Z actually wants face-to-face interaction. And we're going to see that play out as we talk about life post-pandemic here in just a minute. But again, don't believe that just because they have that technology and know how to use it, that's the only way they want to communicate. They do want to be a part of something. It's really important, and it's easy for us who have been around for a few years and who have been in the workforce for a number of decades to talk at younger folks, people in this generation, and even the younger millennials. Don't do it. Talk with them, talk to them, don't talk at them, listen to them, let them know that you value their opinion. Realize, though, up front that this is a very spontaneous group of folks. They're very spontaneous, very unpredictable, and get them to join your tribe. If you haven't read Seth Godin's book, Tribes, I recommend it for any leader or anyone who wants to be a leader. It's one of those great books, along with Simon Sinek's Start With Why. Seth Godin says the only two things you need to form a tribe is a shared interest and a way to communicate. And so let them join your tribe. Let them share your interests as it comes to helping your company or your division or your unit grow. And once they engage, they'll be a fantastic part of this. Recognize that folks in this generation are just entering the workforce. They have a lot to learn. So did we. And so we need to be more patient with them, and especially when it comes to communication. We also need to understand the impact that the pandemic has had on their integration into the workforce. We'll talk about that more in detail in just a second, but think about it. This generation, many of them were just graduating from college last year, and their graduation, if it happened at all, was virtual. or it was socially distanced. Many of the folks in this generation have spent the last full year at least at home instead of being at school. And so it's very difficult for them. And we need to understand and appreciate that this generation, more than any generation, is going to be impacted by what has happened in our society over the past year. So I want to take just a minute and talk about the pandemic's effect on this generation in particular, just because they are going to play such an important part on our organizations going forward. Keep in mind, many folks in this generation are just now entering the workforce. I mean, they're right out of high school and they decided not to go to college. What did they do? They may have gotten a job at a restaurant or a retail operation. What happened? A lot of those organizations were closed. A lot of those businesses were shuttered. A lot of those operations were changed so that they weren't a big part of those operations like they thought they may have become. Gen Z, these are the folks who were most likely to lose their job or to have their hours reduced or their pay cut, especially when the pandemic first hit. Again, it's the last one hired, first one fired. And so they are reeling from what happened more so than most other generations. Again, physically speaking, Gen Z's pretty immune to the COVID. You hear a case here and there of young folks who got affected. They weren't the ones who were dying. It was the boomers and the pre-boomers who were mostly physically impacted by the COVID. So, but they were impacted other ways. And this, over the course of their career, is going to make it more difficult to maintain their loyalty. Again, this event is probably one of the biggest, most important events that's going to color how they view the world, color those glasses, how they look at the world over the next 20, 30, 40 years or more. And again, before the pandemic, if you hired a new employee, how did you onboard them? Typically, it was done in person. Now onboarding is remote. And so as a result, these new employees are starting off from day one with less of a connection to their team and their employer. And again, we're not talking about a technology connection, a technological connection. We're talking about a physical connection. They're not building those relationships or those friendships on day one that some of us have carried through years working with organizations, with the folks that we onboarded with. This is likely going to have a major impact on turnover of organizations and on employee engagement for years to come. This is amazing to me, but 2/3 of Gen Z surveyed say that they feel anxiety nearly every day as this pandemic is dragged on. That's triple the rate of baby boomers. And again, baby boomers are the ones who are some of the most highly impacted physically to the pandemic, yet more than 3 times as many Gen Zs they feel anxiety about it than baby boomers. 25% of Gen Z folks say they don't think they'll be better off post-pandemic than before the pandemic. So there's a lot of pessimism there about how the future is. As a leader of an organization, it's up to you to help them become more optimistic. And part of that is being an effective communicator with them. 95% of Gen Z and 93% of millennials have reported that they have difficulty working remotely. Again, not from the technological standpoint. They know how to use the technology. They know how to use Microsoft Teams. They just don't enjoy that remote work environment because they feel less connected than older generations. It's always been interesting to me that the newest generations are the most connected with technology, but they have the least amount of those interpersonal relationships. Break that cycle in your organizations. Become effective communicators with them, connect with them, and you'll be able to lead them. These folks are less informed about what's going on at their companies. And again, I know a lot of companies are doing a good job of sending out memos and emails and videos about what's going on. I've been looking for a job for the past few months, and as I remember, one of the interviews questions I was asked by a great company was, give me an example of when you failed at your job. And I told them frankly about when I was new as a professional communicator. I confused telling with communicating. And so we have to make sure that we're not just telling folks about what's going on with our company, that we're actually communicating. We're making sure that what we're telling them is resonating with them so that they can give that buy-in. These folks are reporting difficulty working with their colleagues from a distance. And again, it's not because of the technology, it's because that human connection isn't there. What I think is really interesting, that a large number of Gen Zs that were surveyed reported that video calls hurt their productivity. And I don't know that we're talking about if there's a video call to go over a project, but some folks have had the great ideas of having the virtual cocktail hours and virtual, let's show off our pets during an hour Zoom meeting. Hey, all that stuff is great, but make sure that the folks that you are doing that for really want it. And part of that is having those relationships with your employees and the folks in your organization, because oftentimes they don't want it. They want to get their work done so that they can, do whatever it is they want to do, frisbee golf or video games or whatever. Let them do it. 35% of Gen Z surveyed said that working remotely has hurt their work-life balance. And it goes back to those video calls and things like that. So what does all this mean? We face a very unique challenge. It's never happened before in the workplace, that being that there are 5 generations. So we can't just take that one-size-fits-all approach. We have to do a better job to learn the language and understand our audiences, learn the languages that they speak, so that we can be more effective leaders. We need to use the channels and methods of communications that they prefer, not necessarily what we prefer. I don't mind sending out a bunch of emails, but unfortunately, some generations prefer to pick up a piece of paper and read it that way, or they prefer me to pick up the phone and talk to them that way. So if that's what our generation that we're trying to reach prefers, that's what we have to do. Remember, one size doesn't fit all. I've worked in large organizations of 2,000 employees or larger, and I've had to use multiple channels of communication in order to reach and get our message across to everybody, again, because every generation prefers to receive their messages differently. Forget the stereotypes. Again, just because they're a Gen Z doesn't mean that they're a technophile. Just because you're a baby boomer doesn't mean you don't know how to use technology. We have to get to know and develop those relationships with our folks so that we can better reach them. Don't be afraid to try new things either. And if you tried something 5 years ago as far as communicating and it didn't work, don't be afraid to try it again, because our workforce is different today. We have different tools at our disposal. We have different technologies available to us. So don't be afraid to try new things. And again, this isn't a science, it's an art. And so what may be true today may not be true tomorrow. We always have to keep learning. We always have to keep working to apply new standards, new things in order to reach our folks. And that is all I have. Now, there's my email address. If you have questions for me or comments for me, send me a note, wewatson@cox.net, and I'll be happy to get back with you and try and help you any way I can. Scott, do we have any questions to go over?
I don't think we really have any specific questions yet. We'll give people an opportunity maybe to ask some. I think, thank you very much, Whitney, for doing the presentation. I know the feedback that we've been kind of reading has been really positive. I think people really enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, good.
It's so funny because I sit here and I listen to all this and I think I don't have to deal with any of this because I'm working with some ladies who have all been in the office working for the chamber for about 15 or so years, so 10 to 15 years. So,
but you do have to, because the chamber members are very diverse.
They do, yeah. Very different when it comes to the members, though.
Yeah, so, if your membership is like the Independence Chamber, and even our board of directors, we had 20, 22, 23, 24-year-olds, and we had 85-year-olds. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, and I do like the fact that it seems like you said Gen Z was more interested in face-to-face communication, which I think is really good, especially from a chamber's perspective, when so much of our networking is really face-to-face. So somebody's asking what part of the country you live in. I think
Topeka, Kansas.
There you go.
The great state of Kansas. home of some of the best surfing and best skiing in the world, right here in Kansas.
Yeah, very good.
Of course, that's not true.
So if I could just reiterate, there were people looking for the books, and I re-mentioned them in the comments for Seth Godin and Simon Sinek. So check out the comments. I put them back there.
Seth Godin Tribes is a must-read. Simon Sinek, Start With Why. All of his books are great, but Start With Why in particular. The Credible Company, Communicating with Today's Skeptical Workforce is a great read by Roger Dupree.
Very cool.
Anything by John Maxwell.
I was going to say, I have a kind of a funny story about Seth Godin. Lori and I actually got an opportunity to be part of a small group presentation with Seth Godin years ago at a conference. And
that'd be cool.
Neither one of us at that time even knew who he was, you know. And so we go and then we sit in on it. And she actually won it through a business card drawing, I think, wasn't it, Lori? She won it through a business card drawing. So they selected her card as the card, you know, as the winner. So she got to take another person with her, which I think I was the only other person that was with her from our office. So she took me, and you know, he's certainly a really interesting guy, and it was really enjoyable listening to some of his thoughts and concepts. So very cool.
We just have so many opportunities to engage our workforce, and we have to do that. So there's so many challenges today, especially when we return. We're going to return from this. I mean, the new normal is going to go back to the old normal, right? Yeah. And it's going to happen, I think, sooner. You're fortunate that you live in a great state. You have a great governor. I'm a huge fan of Governor Parson. And so you'll probably return to the old normal before we do here in Kansas. But once we do, we have to be prepared to come out guns a-blazing. We're going to have to work really hard to re-engage our workforce. And part of that is making sure that we're communicating with them as effectively as we can.
Yeah, I agree totally. So, well, thank you again for your time. Looks like we've answered most of the questions. Looks like someone might have.
Remind everybody, it will be saved on our Facebook page and or the YouTube channel. So everybody's asking if it was going to be replayed or if the slides were going to be shared. So just check back. It will be saved.
Perfect.
Right.
Well, thank you so much again, Whitney, for your time today. We appreciate you joining us from Kansas, from the great state of Kansas, and sharing your wisdom with our members. So
happy to be with you.
I don't think we have any more of these scheduled. Is that correct?
No, this was the last one.
This was the last one. So I was thinking. So we try to do them. I think we're going to try to make it a habit of since the winter time is a little bit slow of doing our Chamber University for maybe the first quarter with maybe one or two sprinkled in throughout the year, but we'll be heavy on Chamber University typically in the first quarter going forward. So anyway, everyone that's joined us, I guess, for this year's series of Chamber University, we thank you. Again, Lori said it will be saved on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, so anybody can view it at a later time. So anyway, thanks again, and we will chat with you soon. Thanks, Whitney.
I was just going to add one more thing. Whitney is on LinkedIn, so if you care to link in with him, that's how I was able to track him down.
Track me down. You can get a job as a bill collector because you were able to track me down and find me. So,
she does do a certain amount of that. Her and Terry do that from our office. So anyway, between the two of them, we collect most of our bills, most of the outstanding bills. So
Whitney, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here. You're welcome. Thanks so much.
Have a great day. We'll see you.
You too.
Bye.
Take care.